From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
The House Foreign Affairs Committee releases its report on the American exit from Afghanistan in 2021. And the revelation is that President Biden ignored the advice of nearly all of his military and security advisors. What have been the consequences of that Afghan withdrawal 3 years later, and how does it bear on the decision Americans face in this election campaign about who should be the next commander-in-chief, Kamala Harris or Donald Trump? I'm Paul Gigot, editor of the editorial page of the Wall Street Journal, and welcome to Potomac Watch, our daily podcast of the Journal editorial page. I'm here with my colleagues Kate Batchelder-Odell and Joe Sternberg. The House Foreign Affairs Committee is releasing its long-awaited report on Afghanistan. It's more than 2 years in the making, and it's 350 or so pages and loaded with information about one of the most humiliating episodes in recent American foreign policy. Let's listen to Chairman Michael McCaul explain why this report is coming out now.
Why is it important right now, Margaret? Because the foreign policy is at stake. What happened after Afghanistan impacted the world. Why? Because Putin responded by invading Ukraine 2 months after Afghanistan fell. Chairman Xi, Putin made an unholy alliance in Beijing, threatening the Pacific now. And then the Ayatollah reared his ugly head in the Middle East. And we're seeing this finally, this is really important. The Bagram prisons unleashed thousands of ISIS-K prisoners that went to the Khorasan region. 8 of those, and that's who we know about, have been detained by the FBI in the United States that got in through the southwest border. This is a failed foreign policy colliding with a failed border policy all at the same time.
Chairman Michael McCaul of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, a Republican. Kate, looking at the report, what are a couple of the major takeaways that you have?
Well, I think the report deserves credit for trying to reconstruct the decision-making process around Biden's withdrawal from Afghanistan. It really is remarkable the extent to which Biden was hell-bent on getting out of Afghanistan, no matter the cost or the countervailing advice he received. This report suggests that everyone from General Milley, chairman of the Joint Chiefs, to the commander of Central Command, advised him against removing a small complement of 2,500 troops who were in Afghanistan at the time, and that if he did, it would be a matter of when, not if, the Afghan government would collapse. So the unanimity of that advice is startling and documented well in the report. The second thing that I think is really notable is the basic failure to plan to leave even after the Biden administration decided to get out is notable. And the administration pulls air support, military contractors, closes Bagram Air Base, but does not account for how they're going to get U.S. embassy personnel out of the country. And if anything, the committee says it's found that the size of the U.S. embassy in Kabul grew during the retrograde because the administration insisted on maintaining a diplomatic footprint there. So these are some of the basic failures that went into the planning process that resulted in having to use the civilian airport to exit the country, Kabul airport. That was a security nightmare that resulted in the death of 13 service members from an attack from ISIS-K. So the failures here are startling and occur at kind of every major decision point as the Biden administration says, we're getting out by the anniversary of 9/11. It doesn't matter that the Taliban's not following the conditions it's agreed upon. It doesn't matter that we don't have an organized plan to get the U.S. embassy personnel out. The commitment to that, in spite of all the evidence, I think is the most arresting takeaway of the report.
Let's try to break those down one by one and first take the point about Biden's insistence that he get out, despite the advice of his advisors. Joe Sternberg, it's really something to think that here, Joe Biden, he's not known for a lot of firm positions, right? He's somebody who has always tended to say to the Democratic Party, where do you want to go? I'll get in front of the parade and let's go. In this case, he really did insist, despite the advice of every senior advisor except for Jake Sullivan, to the National Security Advisor, that he was hell-bent on getting out. And he was hell-bent on getting out on the anniversary, or close to it, of 9/11 and our entry into Afghanistan in 2021. And once you set that kind of political timetable, it begins to box you in. As Kate pointed out, the CIA was suggesting that the Afghan government would eventually collapse. Now, they didn't say it would be as fast as it did, but they were basically saying, if you pull out those 2,500 troops, the Taliban will take over.
Yeah, Paul, that was the thing that I actually found the most startling as I was flipping through this report, because usually if you have had a massive policy failure on the part of the government, whether it was September 11th or the 2008 financial crisis or any of the rest of it, you get these multiple hundred-page reports that highlight a string of failures across the government where this agency messed up and that agency messed up in this other way, and it becomes this very complicated picture. And what comes through from this report is actually most of the government seems to have done its job more or less in terms of different agencies, different senior advisors and officials within the government giving sound advice to a president who then refused to follow it. So what we have here is really unusually, for one of these government failures, an instance where there was one point of failure, and that was in the Oval Office. And I would point out that, they have very harsh things to say about Jake Sullivan's role in this, but they also point out that Vice President Kamala Harris was involved in a lot of this decision-making as well. And I think that that's important because this is perhaps one of the few insights that the American public is going to get about her foreign policy views or inclinations before we vote in November. And, it's significant to understand that she participated in this very focused failure within the White House.
Well, I want to get to that discussion here a little bit, but first we're going to take a break, and when we come back, we'll talk more about what we are learning from the Afghan withdrawal report when we come back. Welcome back. I'm Paul Gigot with our daily Potomac Watch podcast here on WSJ Opinion. And I'm here with Joe Sternberg and Kate Odell. I just want to pursue this other point, Kate, that you brought up first, which is, I think, significant in addition to the advice that was ignored. It's the failure to plan for the potential scenario that unfolded. Now, our spooks did not think that the Afghan government would collapse right away, but it's astonishing to learn in the report that the general evacuation order wasn't given until August 16th, one day before Kabul fell to the Taliban. One day. It's truly remarkable. So that's one of the reasons there was such a chaotic rush. And it's also the tremendous mistake of abandoning Bagram Air Base, this expansive air base, very well defended, that could have been used as an evacuation point. And that would have been a much safer point, much more protected, much less protected from a suicide bomber, from snipers, from the Taliban. And instead, they had to use Kabul airport, as you suggested. And they abandoned Bagram overnight, just left. The Afghans didn't even know we were leaving.
Well, right. I mean, keep in mind, we had spent $100 million on a 12,000-foot runway at Bagram Air Base. It was a far more secure facility and could have been a place to manage evacuations. The report does go into some detail about how if you wanted to keep that air base open, that required the complement of 2,500 troops. And the Biden administration was operating under an artificial political cap of 600 only. And so that necessitated the closure of Bagram Air Base. You also have in the report some documentation of military officials saying, are you sure you want to close our secure air base? As they're going through closing out all sorts of facilities like that, there was reticence even before things went so south to close this air base, but the administration insisted on doing it. And so that is how you got to the conditions that were at Kabul Civilian Airport, where you actually had to bring in U.S. troops from other parts of the region to try to secure the airport, which, as we know, turned out to be very difficult to do.
All right, let's listen to another line of criticism of the report, which is that it doesn't give enough space in its report to the fact that Trump had also decided, President Trump, that he wanted to leave Afghanistan and that there was an accord, the so-called Doha Accord in 2020, that did set a date for U.S. withdrawal into 2021. Let's listen to Chairman McCall again.
Did you identify mistakes by the Trump administration?
Well, we identified Zal-Khalilzad. The mistake here with
the negotiator.
With Doha was the fact that he negotiates with the Taliban and leaves out the Afghan government.
Right.
That was a slap in the face to them, and it was not good for morale. Having said that, the Taliban...
That was the Trump policy.
Yeah, and the Taliban was in violation of Doha. That's why Trump left 2,500 troops. When President Biden came into office, it was very clear, go to zero In fact, his press guy said it's immaterial. Doha agreement's immaterial to us going to zero.
Yeah.
We're getting the hell out of there, irrespective of conditions on the ground.
Mike McCall is referring to Zalmay Khalilzad, who was the Trump administration's chief negotiator with the Taliban in Doha. And he's absolutely right that they excluded the Afghan government from the negotiations, which was, I think, a huge blunder. But, Joe, my view is that the report seems to give Trump too much of a pass here. Trump was setting the goal to get out of Afghanistan one way or another, and I think he was intent upon it. Now, the question that doesn't absolve the Biden administration from the manner in which they did it or for the timetable that they adhered to. And, of course, any new president is not bound by everything that a previous president does. And Biden could have adjusted the terms, particularly, as McCall points out, because the Taliban was violating the Doha Accord. But still, Trump did make life more difficult for Biden with his decision in 2020.
I think that is certainly correct. I think that Trump's conceit was that he could do a deal with the Taliban in the same way that he thinks that he can do a deal with everyone else. This was sort of a characteristic problem that you ran into in a lot of instances during Trump's administration on foreign policy issues, this tendency to want to negotiate with people whether or not that was likely to be fruitful. I mean, certainly Trump himself now would say that the fiasco that ultimately unfolded in August 2021 wouldn't have happened on his watch because he would have been a better negotiator or he would have been savvier about arranging the conditions for the withdrawal or something like that. I mean, I think that a lot of that is probably debatable because if the complaint here is that Joe Biden didn't follow sound advice, Trump is not particularly well known for following sound advice himself. But, I think, Paul, you've also hit on the key political problem for the Democrats if they want to make that argument, which is that Biden campaigned on the premise of being the anti-Trump in every other policy area, except for this one. I mean, it's kind of a difficult argument for them to try to make, especially because it happened in August after the Biden administration had been in place for many months in that first year, and there would have been ample opportunities for them to change course. And so I think that it's true that neither Trump nor Biden comes out of the situation looking particularly savvy or, like a good leader, but ultimately it is Biden who was the president at the time that the president made these bad decisions.